Funky Politics.
Welcome to Funky Politics, empowered by the Kazukian Network, where we keep it real, righteous, and funky. My name is Terrence Patterson, and I'm your co-host, and I'm joined today by my fellow co-host,
Lee Eric Smith.
And Lisa Moore.
What's going on, guys?
Hey.
Happy to be
not
here
a guy.
with you.
I'm not a guy.
Guys and gals.
Thank you. I'm
Good to
doing
see you.
great.
That's she, her.
Thank you for including me.
And look, be sure to listen to our podcast and other shows on the Kazukian app, website, or your favorite streaming platform. Today, we are going to be talking critical race theory.
Yes.
Critical race theory. Is that next to Big Bang Theory? That was one of my favorite shows late at night. No?
No, it ain't. It's not that, but I'm going to break it down for you. And we're joined by my friend and wonderful rock star, Sharonda Bossier, who is the CEO of Education Leaders of Color, also known as EdLock. Sharonda, how are you today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, y'all. Excited to be here.
Good. Well, look, before we jump in and talk a little bit, I wanted to at least ground the conversation with at least a bit of a definition on what critical race theory is. It is an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists who seek to critically examine the law as it intersects with issues of race and to challenge mainstream liberal approaches to racial justice. All right, you know what?
What?
That ain't.
I don't think that's what.
You lost America.
That sounds very academic.
I knew that was going to happen.
So,
And everyone just turned off the radio.
Break down what it is.
I'm not going to break it down what it is, but in the spirit of one of our great ancestors, Mr. Fred Sanford, where he looked over at from the white cop to the black cop and said, "Smitty, what did they really say? Sharonda."
What did I really say?
Can you be our Smitty? Can you, in lay terms, kind of break down what the conversation about critical race theory, where it starts?
Yeah, it's really an attempt to get people to come to terms with a more complete understanding of the history of this country, right? It's this idea that you can't talk about where we are without first understanding how race has shaped everything in this country, right? From how we understood who was able to participate in the early days of our democracy to who was able to take advantage of early government programs that have built the middle class, all of that was constructed in a way to preserve whiteness. And until you can talk about that explicitly, until you can talk about the fact that when we talk about, for instance, the New Deal programs or the war on poverty, that Black people and other people of color were intentionally left out of those programs, we cannot have a conversation about where we need to go as a country. So it's an attempt at saying, you think you know the full story, right? Mm-hmm. But you have no idea. Mm-hmm. And here are the ways in which race intersects with how we have done things from the very, very beginning here, right? The way that it has been cast by people who are opponents of critical race theory, though, is that we want to talk about how white people are bad, right? How everything they have is something that they haven't earned, and that it's an attempt at telling a different version of history, when I think the folks who have been working on this and have been kind of leading this push against civil rights activists and other scholars would say it's an attempt at telling a more complete version of history.
Right. And it's so important because all across the country now, we're seeing legislation being passed that is banning the teaching of critical race theory.
Which is, I assume, at the K through 12 level anyway, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And, I agree. I don't know how it is possible to even teach American history without teaching some of these other aspects of history, although we've certainly seen that done over time. But clearly, what we're seeing the pushback around is, I guess, fragility. Are we trying to protect people from feeling too bad about the color of their skin?
I think we infantilize white people in conversations around race in this country, right? I think, and I think critical race theory actually helps us identify where white people have been about it, right? And have been on the front lines of the war, against oppression, et cetera. I think How do I want to say this without? I do think that I do think that
We keep it real, righteous, and funky.
Right.
yeah, the construct of whiteness is a fragile one, right? And I think it's why it's had to figure out how to expand to include more people, right? So that we stop attacking it. And I think that it's an attempt at, again, sort of casting the folks who came before us as if they were perfect, right? So that we don't interrogate the systems that they built. We don't interrogate how we got here. And definitely all of that is in service of whiteness and in white fragility and white ego, right?
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, no, I was just, and let me get to this real quick, because you hit on something I want to get to, because you seem to make a distinction between whiteness as, I guess, a term of identification or self-identification, and let's just say a person who is running around in fairer skin, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Can you kind of make a little bit clearer about I guess the identity of whiteness and protecting it versus the people who, whether they've chosen to or not, are ascribed to that?
Yeah, so I think of whiteness as a system and as a construct, right? And so I think about, even if we think about over the evolution of the history of this country, who's been included in whiteness, that has changed, right? So you'll meet people who are Irish who will tell you, well, when my family first got here, we weren't white, and they're right? And so when you are white, it means that you have access to a set of privileges that exist in this country, right? And sometimes there are people who are classified as white here who do not read as white in your social interactions, right? Think about a lot of folks from the Middle East and North Africa as examples there, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I'm talking about whiteness, I'm talking about being able to opt into or access privileges, sets of rights that are exclusive, right? That mean that you enjoy a different level of citizenship in this country, right? And there are people who opt into that. And I think we are watching actually whiteness expand in this particular moment to include new groups. We are watching it include certain Latino or Latinx populations, right? If you're a third or fourth generation Texan, it's like, and you might have a Spanish or Mexican surname, right? But you might be able to opt into whiteness. We see this around folks like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, exactly, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And so they might not be people that we immediately would identify as white, but they are able to lean into and opt into, right, the rights and privileges that come with whiteness. Right. And so whiteness is a system more than it is an identity in this country. And sometimes I think parsing the two helps people understand how they participate in either. It also, I think, helps people of color understand the work that we do to sometimes jockey to be proximate to whiteness. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, my name is Sharonda Bossier. I ain't gonna never be white, right? Ain't gonna happen. But there are things that I can do that position me as proximate to whiteness that do give me power. And like, we have to talk about that too.
Wow.
Well, I think what's interesting is as an educator myself and an education background, is really what we're talking about and what's being legislated right now in so many states is what are the parameters for which we can teach children about history and our background and who we are as a nation. And this really bizarre playbook has been kind of circulated out into the conservative communities around, now we're teaching that the United States is a racist nation, or other kind of propaganda, kind of triggering statements, when history is history is history is history. And when can we get to a place in academia, in teaching our children, this is what has happened and this is why it happened? Or actually, how about let's let kids come up with why they think it happened, or let them be critical thinkers around what was happening at the time. And this is what the system was, who benefited from the system, what was the system set up for? I think we sell our children short when we don't give them the opportunity to explore difficult topics and make their own meaning from it. And sometimes be really uncomfortable. I'm really uncomfortable that we've enslaved people. I'm really uncomfortable that we've had internment camps. I'm really uncomfortable that we've never kept a treaty with Native American indigenous peoples. I'm really uncomfortable with that. And it's our history. Does it, make me feel guilty as as a white woman who has a family who did own people. I've got documentation. That is fact. It's in paper. It's in writing. You can't disassociate from who we are. And this notion that's being put out there, on the news channels is that to have critical race theory, to have a deep inquiry around our history is revisionist, is just insanity.
Well, you run the risk of having oncoming generations tell you were wrong about stuff. And it's all fun until the teenager comes home. And I got a teenager. I haven't had this one yet. But until the teenager comes on and says, Daddy, everything you taught us was wrong. And that's the conversation that these voting parents a lot of times don't want to have, right?
Or they want to ask you what you did, right, when you witness injustice. And I think that's the hardest thing to answer when you're a parent, right, is did you know this was wrong? And if so, what did you do about it? And no one wants to have to stand in front of their kid and say nothing, right, that when faced with injustice, they didn't push back.
But that brings me to an interesting point. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Sharonda, which is I do a thought experiment. And it started with some years ago, I saw a clip with Morgan Freeman, someone asking him, how do you think we get past the problem of race in America? And he just said, stop talking about it. I was like, Morgan Freeman, for somebody that sounds like God all the time, that was pretty dumb what you just said.
Come on, man.
Do better.
But,
bruh.
But, hold on. But then I thought about it and meditated upon it. And it kind of brought me to a lot of different places. And one of the places is this. White supremacy happened to white people too, right? There was we talk about it now like, what did you do? Did you take a stand? Well, no. Well, why? Because I didn't want a cross burn in my yard, and I didn't want to lose my job, so I couldn't feed you, your mama, and your 14 brothers. I mean, there was a cost to pay if you got out of line, whether you were black or white, and that's part of the story too, right, Sharonda?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is. When we talk about infantilizing white people or in conversations around race, right, we don't talk about, to your point, the cost of white supremacy for them, right? It robs them of the ability to be human, to develop empathy across lines of difference, right, et cetera. And I think that, again, right, opening the door to these kinds of conversations helps us all see, I think, more clearly how we are in this together. The other thing I will say is that the right has done a really good job of making this the new front in the culture wars, right? For all intents and purposes, they've lost the gay marriage fight, right? For all intents and purposes, they've sort of lost the abortion fight. It's one that they keep fighting, but for the most part, I think public opinion still believes that abortion should be safe, legal, accessible for people, right? And this is the new front in the culture war for them. It's a way of continuing to sort of divide us into different camps, making us feel like we have no shared history or interests. And it's a way for a very small group of people to maintain power, right? By saying it's the left's fault, right? They want to shove this down your throat. And it's the people in California and New York who want to talk about this. And we're not those people. And they have really, really done a good job of defining this as the new front in the culture war.
Yeah, and that culture war point is a really important one, because I find this issue as being highly politicized, because when you get down on the ground level, and Lisa, you mentioned this, when it gets to the classroom and it gets to the teacher, how are they going to monitor or turn in the teacher that has the rich conversation about slavery in the South, or that talks about Tulsa or Memphis or some of these places where some of these really sort of disgusting acts happen, that would allow a child to perhaps have a view or have an uncomfortable conversation? Then what does that look like? Are you turned in? Is there some type of documentation? And then, so for me, it does feel like it's political posturing, frankly. And at the end of the day, I hope that we can empower our educators to just teach the facts and to provide opportunities for our children to have a view.
You mean the facts or the alternative facts? It's different.
Yeah.
I mean the facts.
Or do you mean that's the facts?
Alternative facts.
Do you mean that's the facts, Jax? You know what I'm saying? No?
Lee, this
Okay.
You know what, Lee? I'm gonna come back to that.
Yeah.
Lisa,
Yeah.
Lisa, get him.
Yeah, well, I can't do that, but I can weigh in on some educational discussions.
Weigh in.
You know, my daughter, who is a brilliant mind, is entering into a classroom of a new school next year as a middle school history teacher. And she is grappling with how to speak the truth and how to lay out a curricula that is engaged and is thoughtful and is factual. And you have to do that in a way that is age appropriate and age intentional. And so it's and the thought that there could be like this monitoring camera in her classroom or something to see what is happening.
Right.
You know,
or a little
how
white
are
child.
you discussing?
Right, or a little white child is going to go run and tell.
Go run home and
his or
say
her
you made me
mother."
uncomfortable. Right.
Right.
You know, I can honestly say my same daughter, when she was in middle school, had a teacher that was a music teacher that was making a point around civil rights through music. And she got really intense, like really graphically intense. And where the kids came home and were like, what's... our teacher we were in music class and she's talking about castrating men. And not appropriate, right? Yes, facts are facts. Yes, heinous things happen, but how is it presented? How is it discussed?
Right.
How is it discussed? And, you know, we were able to have a follow-up conversation about that. I'm not going to demonize that teacher. She had a point of view, you know, but I do believe with proper educational resources, with proper child development resources and education, our educators are equipped to do what's right by history and what's right by kids and provide them an opportunity to really be critical thinkers. And I think, unfortunately, so much of the curricula in the U.S. has gotten away from critical thinking and has just simply gone to direct regurgitation of whatever we want them to put on a paper that'll pass a test.
In some cases, I mean, now on the math side, this new math that they're teaching,
That's crazy.
they're using the brain on
I
that.
don't know what that is. I mean,
That's
2
what-
plus 2 is 4 in my book. I'm not sure where that's up for question.
That's alternative math.
Oh, you know, and so I think this critical race theory is political, and I think it speaks to really where we are with a broken education system where we're not equipping children to be critical thinkers.
Well, one of the things, though, that jumps out to me, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this too, Sharonda, is what I'm picking up, and I've felt this way for a long time, that this topic of so-called race in the United States, we don't talk about it with the nuance that it deserves. It's a very nuanced kind of topic, you know, and it's so easy to paint it in broad strokes. White folks do this. Black folks eat too much hot sauce, whatever, right? It's easy to talk in those broad strokes, but it doesn't serve anything. It doesn't move the ball. And so I guess what I'm getting at is if we're talking about teaching this in class and, you know, you get to the end of a lesson and you say, okay, what's the lesson, right? I don't know that there's an answer at the end of that question as much as it is that question by itself and wherever it takes the student and in their own conversations in their own life, if you follow what I mean, Sharonda.
I think so. I mean, I do think that it's important to establish that in this country, you know, race has been used again to decide and define who was in the in group and who was in the out group, right? And that the closer you are to whiteness, either in perception or reality, the more rights, privileges, access you have, right? And the closer you are to blackness, less so. And I think especially as our our public schools have become more diverse, and especially as we are welcoming new waves of immigrants to the country, it's an incredibly important conversation. So as someone who works with educators all across the country, right, the folks that I support are talking about like welcoming kids from countries where they walk into the classroom and they are read as Black, but it's the last thing they want to be. Right? Because they have been taught, as their parents have made the journey here, that the worst thing to be in this country is Black. Right. And so when you talk about nuance and we talk about diversity, we also have to talk about the diversity of experience. Right. So my grandparents migrated to the West Coast from Louisiana in the 1930s and 40s. their experience of Blackness is very different than someone who has recently come here from Haiti or from other parts of Latin America or the diaspora, right? And so part of also, I think what critical race theory allows us to do is talk about how unique and different an experience we have based on when our families got here, how they got here, right, et cetera. And as we are, and it's been really interesting as our network, I lead a national membership organization, right, has expanded to include people from Asian and Pacific Islander communities too, right? Okay. And particularly people who were trying to push back on this idea of the model minority myth, right? Because some of our Black and Latinx educators are like, oh, when did Asian people become people of color? Like, I thought I didn't know y'all were people of color. Like, oh, y'all want to get on the party now because diversity, equity, and inclusion is having its moment in the spotlight, right? And then even within the Asian Pacific Islander community, right, we have the colonized and the colonizers, right? Mm-hmm. And so folks are working out what it means to be like, we're not the same. My experience as a Filipino is very different than your experience as a Japanese person, et cetera, right? And so part of leading a community of educators of color is that we do get to dive into that nuance. We do get to talk about how patterns of immigration, et cetera, geography, right, shapes our experience of race. But we also have to have really hard conversations about what it means to be in community and coalition with each other. And there are some times, honestly, y'all, I'm not sure we're going to make it, because people have had very real and hurtful experiences, not just at the hands of white people, but other people of color, right? Yeah. And again, ultimately, no matter where you look across whatever communities, the darker you are, the closer you are to Blackness, again, either real or perceived, the harder it is for people to feel like they can look up and see folks who have stood in solidarity with them. And I'm working with folks who lead districts, schools, et cetera, and there's still very real hurt there. And so when we think about what it means to go into classrooms, into schools, into communities, and have these conversations with young people, adults have a lot of identity work to do too, a lot of baggage to unpack. Mm-hmm. And we have to get clear on actually why we are having these conversations, right? And move from a place of, wanting to always center our own hurt and our own trauma and talk about what it means to build multiracial coalitions. I think that's our only hope.
Yeah.
And, just thinking about, to your point earlier about the political side of it, the what's in it for white supremacy itself is self-preservation, right? As you mentioned, it's very fragile. And we see white supremacy rise whenever there is a moment, and it happened during Reconstruction, it happened during the 60s some, but when you see folks coming together across racial lines, across economic lines, when people see poor white folks and poor Black folks and poor Latinos and poor folks from every walk of life beginning to get together, that's when white supremacy wakes up and says, hold on, y'all don't have that much in common. Back away from each other, please.
Yeah,
there's nothing going on behind the curtain.
Well, the saying "divide and conquer" is for reals, and so those in power know they're outnumbered. If everyone does coalesce and really comes up with a common agenda and a way to kind of move forward in power, and so there is a very intentional work that's done to make sure that these groups stay disparate. So how is it being talked about? Like, who's throwing out there, oh, y'all weren't there when we needed you most? Who's throwing that out there? Right? It's race baiting, and it's keeping groups that are fighting for equity segregated, because the power in coming together would change the face of the nation.
Yeah, and Sharon, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. I mean, are the conservatives fighting or waging a losing battle? Like, what does it look like on the ground? Right? You talk to leaders and educators across the country. This legislation is being passed, but in reality, what do you think is going to really happen in classrooms?
That's a good question. I fear that we're going to see retaliation against teachers who decide to teach what they were going to teach anyway, right? And so sometimes it might be the kid who goes home and tells their parent that they had a conversation that made them uncomfortable, but more often than not, it's parents snooping, right? And looking for things that are aligned with their political agenda. And saying, like, I saw my kid's homework and this is what they're talking about, right? as someone who taught U.S. history, I was in the classroom for 5 years, in thinking about what it meant to tell a more inclusive version of our history. There's always the like, do I say this? Do I raise up this about this person's identity, right, et cetera? Like, what does that get me? What value is there? And ultimately, I decided it was worth the risk because the kids in my classroom share the identities of the folks we were talking about. And I think every kid deserves a hero, right? So I will say, though, that I think conservatives are in a stronger position than we would like to admit. I think there are lots of people, even on the left, who consider themselves progressive, who think of race the moment you mention it, it's divisive, right? Who would like to take the Morgan Freeman approach and just stop talking about it, right? And so I don't know that we have as many people who are willing to go to the mat for pushing about and pushing for critical race theory as we might hope. I think even when you started out reading the definition, right, you're like, people's eyes glaze over. They're like, this ain't got nothing to do with me. This some elite argument, et cetera. And I think it's on us to help people understand how this translates and impacts their real and lived experience. And we haven't done that work well at all.
Sharonda, we're running out of time, but before we get out of here, I do want to hear your take as a historian. I think probably the most under-taught part of American history is the period after the Civil War known as Reconstruction. And I think in so many ways, not just for African Americans, but for the whole country, the lessons, the untaught lessons out of that period of history could really lead us forward. Can you kind of share your thoughts on that and maybe one of those lessons that might pop out at you?
Yeah, I mean, so much, it's such a ripe and rich period for exploration, and I think it's about to have its moment in the sun. I'll say for me, I'm always fascinated by the role and the power of the federal government when we talk about Reconstruction. And there are some people who have tried to cast the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s as sort of Reconstruction Part 2, right? An attempt at this country to kind of go back and actually try and fully live out its values. But with respect to the sort of, period immediately following the Civil War, I think about what it would have meant for the federal government to not give up, right? And to just sort of hold the line on fully integrated freed Black people into society, right? I think about the mechanisms around wealth transfer that were in place. I think about the voices that people had in state legislatures and in Congress even, right, at the time. And I think about what it would have meant for poor whites to have seen that move beneficial to them also, right? And I think that when we talk about critical race theory, I think the next frontier really is critical economic or class theory, right? Because I think too often people are aligning against their own economic interests. And I think, again, that is because whiteness is a currency in our society. It has real value. And so even if people are not aligning with initiatives, priorities, et cetera, that we think meet their financial or economic need, they are aligning with whiteness because there is inherent value in it here still, right? And I think being able to kind of parse those two would have been beneficial to us at that point. The last thing that I will say, right, as a lesson as a feminist from the period immediately following Reconstruction is the exclusion of Black women also, I think, hurt the sort of cause for Black liberation or Black integration, right? I think some of the thinkers and some of the folks who were like pounding the pavement, getting folks, access to programs, et cetera, were women. And we don't hear a lot about those stories. We don't hear a lot about the work they did. And I think, again, because I think all kids deserve heroes, I think we could have learned a lot more from the work that women were doing during that time period too.
Yeah, it's really, thank you for bringing up that point as well, that so much of what's in the legislation that's being put out now that's banning the critical race theory, it's including you cannot talk about gender inequality. So they're taking it all the way. It's not just race inequality; it's gender inequality, and that is detrimental. We say we're losing half the sky when we can't talk about issues that are facing girls and women. So I can't believe we're having to wrap up this conversation. We could really go on for days talking about the power of truth in our education system. And this was a really lively conversation. We want to thank you, Sharonda Bossier from EdLock, CEO of EdLock, to joining us today to talk about this critical issue that's facing our children in our nation on how we are articulating and teaching history across the nation. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a short break. This is Funky Politics, where we keep it real, righteous, and funky. Powered by the Kazukian Network. Check us out on all of your podcast favorite sources. And again, thank you so much, Sharonda, for joining us. And we'll be back in a moment.
Riffin' on jazz.
So all the artists today must be ladies.
Must be.
Oh, my favorite.
You got a problem?
No, that's my favorite.
See, I knew.
Riffin' on jazz on the Kazukian Network.
Welcome back to Funky Politics, empowered by the Kazukian Network. I am Lisa Moore, joined with Terrence Patterson and Lee Eric Smith. And in our last segment, we were talking about critical race theory and how we talk about history. And this segment, I'd like us to talk about a bit of history. How about we talk about the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, where a white mob went to Black Wall Street and for 2 days massacred hundreds of Black residents.
And dropped turpentine
neighbors.
bombs via airplane.
The first time a domestic attack via airplane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was on the Black citizens of the Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921.
And so this is it's a piece of history that you talk to older Black Tulsa residents, and I heard a story where a young man in college was taking a course in college, and they spoke about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, and they talked about the massacre, and he literally rose his hand and said, "You're wrong. I'm from Tulsa. I've never heard of this."
Wow.
So that is...
Speaking of critical race theory.
Speaking of critical race theory. So it had been erased from the Oklahoma history, teaching of Oklahoma history, to the point where a man would say, no, that didn't happen. I'm from there. I should know, only to learn he hadn't been taught his own history. And so this is the segue into this segment. How do we not teach history, and what can we learn? What's to come of this 100th anniversary of a profound moment in American history?
It's interesting, I think, to note. We'd also have to give shout out to the arts, to the film arts, because this, even though the George Floyd and all of the events of 2020 drew attention to this, what really put it on its radar was the hit HBO show Watchmen, which was a continuation of a comic book story by DC. But the producer, Dame Lindelof, had actually read about this story about the Tulsa Race Massacre and decided to set his story, an update of Watchmen, open the very series of the show with a very graphic depiction of that massacre. And then later on, also on HBO, Lovecraft Country, which was also a hit show there, took a dive into it too. So you say what you want to about the arts, but they do help inform and get people curious and wondering about what's happening.
That's true.
As well.
Yeah, no, they do. I mean, I'm still stuck on, the fact that we are in 2021, and for me personally, it's a relatively new aspect of history. I was not aware of it, and even in doing research, I realized there were probably over a dozen other of these types of massacres on Black communities across the South, and really across America.
That's right.
In the last century, and so I think it speaks to why we should be teaching all aspects and all facts, alternative facts, if you will, to some. But the point is, in order for us to be educated as a nation, we have to examine these things, and we can't just sweep them under the rug the way we've done for so long.
Well, it never stays under the rug. It always comes out. It's taken 100 years.
Yeah.
It's taken 100 years, but it's out, and it can never go back under the rug. The art's been made. The stories have been told. 60 Minutes has done the story. It is documented. It is true. it to take 100 years, a little less than 100 years, for Tulsa to start looking for where the bodies are buried, to try to now do some DNA search where families can be reconnected and learn their own history is really profound. And I hope that this is a beginning of an awareness where we can truly talk about historical events, that we really can't. I mean, our very own, Congressman Cohen from the state of Tennessee was a part of the convening of individuals that are living, that were a part
Living
of
survivors.
living survivors.
Right.
A 107-year-old woman talking about how the state had taken her story and had raised millions of dollars for a monument, and she's living in poverty. Yeah. That's a problem.
That's heaviness. It is worth noting, however, that the recognition of this tragic event in American history has reached all the way to the White House. President Joseph Biden today, on Tuesday, June 1st, was in Tulsa. First time I think a president has ever visited Tulsa, period.
Wow.
Is that true?
That's the way he described. He said it on the mic. If you think Joe Biden knows what he's talking about,
I believe he knows.
I
I'm
think
sure
he
he
might
did.
know.
I'm sure he did a fact check.
Fact check that, yeah.
But he says, quote, "For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. But just because history is silent, it doesn't mean that it did not take place. And while darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. It erases nothing. Sometimes some injustices are so heinous, so horrific, so grievous, they can't be buried no matter how hard people try." He goes on to say, hell was unleashed. Literal hell was unleashed. And he says, "My fellow Americans, this was not a riot. This was a massacre."
But
from the President of the United States.
But did he say or mention the other R word?
I was on my way here. I missed that part if he talked about it.
You know what word I'm talking about, Lee?
I think you're talking about receipts, or no?
Close.
Reparations.
Reparations?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
we talk about recognition, right? Like we are acknowledging the moment happened. And this comes up in the context of slavery all of the time. I'm surprised he didn't. It's sort of fancy to say.
Well, he did announce new initiatives to target the racial wealth gap, including expanding access to home ownership and small business ownership for disadvantaged communities. Reading from CBS News reporting, all of this. The Biden administration also setting a goal of increasing the share of federal contracts going to small disadvantaged businesses by 50% by 2026, which would translate to an additional $100 billion over the 5-year span. The administration is also taking steps to end discrimination and bias in housing, including by launching an interagency initiative to combat inequity in home appraisals. The president also noted that Black Americans' homes are often valued less than white families' homes. Joe seems that he wants to do the work. Yeah. He seems like he wants to really draw attention to this and try and make some things right. I think he wants to be a transformational president, whether or not anybody envisioned him that way at first. But he is not shying away from taking on the history, America's troubled history around how it treats its poor citizens.
Well, I'm Team Joe in Kamala. I'm all in, and that feels like feel good policy to me.
A little bit.
I think what would be interesting is for we as a nation, we as a community, to really think about what was happening back when Black Wall Street was possible. What was happening where that community was thriving with lawyers, doctors, business owners, entrepreneurs, families, banks, hospitals, etc. How do we reclaim that sense of ownership and propriety in our communities, where it's not just the big box, it's not just the big? How do we reclaim community and build wealth inside ourselves?
in many ways, the Greenwood district in Tulsa did not need white people's money. And
It did not.
And that had to be absolutely terrifying.
Infuriating.
Well, infuriating and terrifying.
Well, clearly, so much to the point.
That they erased it.
Right. Yeah, economic power is funny how that works.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking through in 2021, to your point, Lisa, what does a Black Wall Street look like today? Or what does Greenwood today look like? Is it a virtual space, right? Is it some type of consortium that spans multiple states and cities and brings commerce together across a variety of different communities? Do we have some version of it? And because we are in 2021, is the Black Wall Street of 1921, is it sort of outdated, and do we have something, or should we be thinking of something relatively newer or different, nuanced? But I think we need it still, and I'm just thinking through and wrestling with what that looks like.
I think, well, just to kind of broaden the question, that our economic systems, we saw it with the financial collapse of 2008. You can't have all of this power, all of this economic power concentrated in one place. It throws the whole system out of balance. So to that degree, I think we need to decentralize as much of this power as possible. And I think it should go into ideally smaller banks, smaller businesses, smaller real estate investment holding companies, if you will, but that you have a lot of smaller things so that all that power isn't concentrated. Now, whether or not we're still in an age where you can really define that by the color of someone's skin, I understand the need for it. I just hope we move past that time where we have to make that distinction at all.
To link back to our segment on critical race theory, I think so much of what created Greenwood was a sense of autonomy and opportunity.
And they couldn't spend their money anywhere. They could,
right,
but
right. And so because so much of the history of success has been erased, the history of profound brilliance and access and game-changing legislation and policy and community, because so much of that has been erased and all we talk about is, slavery. Like they'll allow like that to be kind of talked about as if nothing happened between then and now, that there doesn't appear to be that sense of autonomy we can create this kind of economy for ourselves. I can do this. I can be an entrepreneur. I can, and there's so much of the community. So many of the kids that I work with they just feel stuck, and they don't have enough examples of being unstuck,
right?
To vision the possibility of their own gifts and talents that are abundant and profound, and we need them. And so how can we as an education system, how can we as a community break open? So many structures that we know, our beloved, here in Memphis, Tennessee, our beloved Stax Music record company was absolutely decimated by the banking industry here. Mm-hmm. And, like loans have been given that had a term, but then they called them, and knowing that there was an inability to pay that. So there are systems in place that are keeping people of color from accessing the wealth that they need to grow their business, to build their business, to do, et cetera. So Biden's policies are needed.
Right.
And I think there's more around how we teach, how we inspire, how we motivate, how we equip people to, all children of all backgrounds and ethnicities and experiences, and to come into their fullness of whatever it is they want to do, be, and create. And I do believe that our current digital lives create an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. We have platforms.
We have platforms that are available that make wealth and autonomy possible.
And I guess what always strikes me in the context of an event like the massacre in Tulsa is when we do talk about reparations, or I think about the woman that is 107, who was a survivor of that incident. What does reparation or support look like today? Mm-hmm. Is it some distribution of wealth? Is it some access at some discounted rate? Like what does the package look like? Not necessarily just for the community at large, but for the individuals that had a direct link, right? We often hear people talk about what reparation or what this recognition looks like, and it is sort of spoken in a very broad, sort of global term, but never specific. And even when it is talked about in a specific context, I've never heard it sort of play itself all the way out. So that's why I just bring it up. Lee, you're shaking your head a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. So I watched the whole series Watchmen on HBO.
Okay.
Whole story takes place in Tulsa, and it's centered around white supremacy, et cetera. And they actually did have in the storyline of the show, the African American descendants of the Tulsa race massacre did receive reparations from President Robert Redford. It's a comic book story, right?
Okay, all right.
But they called on the show. They called, part of it. It was almost a racial slur among the white supremacists on the show to call them Redfordations, right? Like you get your Redfordations check, huh? Like you didn't earn that, or something like that. And I guess it kind of brings me to the point of I know that even as much justice as could be done to right those wrongs, that there would be an undercurrent, a backlash of considerable proportion that would have me wondering if the country could survive it. In principle, I agree reparations should absolutely happen. Relative to the survival of the country, I think the idea of trying to execute that might literally tear the country apart. And if we've learned
that it's torn now,
if we've learned anything, I think it's how fragile I think our democracy is. I think so. I don't know. I'm on the fence about how to actually do it in a way that heals the country as opposed to causes more strife, if you will.
And it seems like the approach has been an access to greater opportunity, right? Like I think some of the things that you listed from the CBS article,
right?
It's more about prospective opportunities and making sure communities are educated so they have greater access. But it is less of, to your point, kind of looking back, and it's being more prospective. But again, I don't know if I've seen it sort of play out all the way to the end.
But one of the things I wonder about, let's just kind of game this out a little bit. So let's say we start teaching the Tulsa Race Massacre in history classes in 8th, 9th grade, 10th maybe?
Well, that massacre and the other dozen or so that also happen across the country. But go ahead.
So what would be the takeaway? What do we want if I'm an education policy maker and I'm saying, okay, these children will benefit from learning about this in this way, what ways would you say?
Well, I think the classic saying of unless you learn your history, you're bound to repeat it is a true statement. And so, and I want to go back to kind of a comment I made in the previous segment of we sell our children short when we don't allow them to grapple with things. So you provide them a scenario. I mean, Facing History and Ourself does a great job of providing young people an opportunity to read a historical document and to grapple with it and to talk about it and to make meaning of it. And so that is what we simply want. What we want is for children to be critical thinkers, to know their history and to say, wow, that is really terrible. And then the follow-up question is, how do we keep it from ever happening again? Providing young people an opportunity. Have you ever faced injustice? How can we keep that from happening again? And we don't provide, I was a leader with an organization that that did just that, that brought a diverse group of young people together to really grapple with what does equity and injustice look like? What does it feel like? What's it smell like? And what do we do about it? And that's usually the missing piece. What do we do with it? How do we take it forward? And how do we give, our young people the tools to affect change because they will one day be policymakers. So if there were policies that made this possible, how do we ensure that we don't have those types of policies going forward?
In a lot of ways, I think the for lack of a better term, the critical race theory is already out of the bag, because unlike the 1960s, where you could only get certain lessons from, a 400-page textbook, you can do all your own research now. Like, just because they're not going to let these teachers teach this in school,
doesn't mean they're not going to learn it.
Doesn't mean they're not.
That's like
learn.
Saying, we're not going to do, comprehensive sex education in schools. Because
they'll never find out about
they'll
this
never
stuff.
they'll never think about sex if we don't teach it.
Right. So I'm just of a mind, and you could argue that might even be more dangerous because, of course, not all the sources on the internet are verified, reliable.
That's right.
And they all carry their own biases. I think we're entering a stage in society now where people are realizing that really history. How's the quote go? History is a lie agreed upon. Or history is written by the victor. Written by the victors, right? The people who won.
That's right.
Well, and that speaks to conflict, and to me, the biggest lesson is the wrong in violence, right? I mean, we are living in an inherently violent society.
Yeah.
And when we look back and children wonder about their anger, or they wonder about the contentious nature of certain aspects of our society. If you look at Detroit, Washington, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Atlanta, Memphis, Charleston, Eufaula, Camilla, it will shine a light on what violence does to a community, right?
Right.
We can learn
and trauma
exactly. We can learn from these types of acts or events, not just even as individualized moments, but when we look at them together, it also speaks to the challenges of race and poverty and why we have certain dissension amongst us in America, right? Like, so I think there are lots of layers, Lee, that we can learn from this, whether it's taught in an American history class, it's taught in a civics class, it's taught in a
Watchmen?
Civility class.
All right.
Man, you're going to make me go look at Watchmen.
You need to go watch it. You need to go watch that because Regina King is a goddess, bruh. That's what I'm saying.
Fair enough.
Right.
And there's no spoilers there. But hear me out. But no, can I just be honest with this for a second? We only have a little bit of time left, but I want to be honest, man. And I'm grateful because, so the watershed event of the past year and a half, of course, has been when George Floyd was killed. We knew police officers, some of them, had committed heinous crimes before that. We knew a lot of bad things that happened to African Americans before that, and that just kind of brought it all to light. And I'm kind of getting burned out on getting dragged back to stories of trauma, black people getting hurt and killed, and this is what the bad stuff that happened. I mean, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm not saying the stories don't need to be heard. I'm not saying that we don't have anything to learn from it. It's just that for African Americans, I think a lot of us we knew these stories. This wasn't my first time hearing about the Tulsa race riot. I can't remember exactly when I had heard about it, but it was in an African American history book, probably.
But did you hear about the other dozen, though?
I did, because I actually did read From Slavery to Freedom by Dr. John Hope Franklin. Okay. Outstanding history book. Everybody should check it out. But my point is that wasn't my first time hearing about it. And so, I don't know, I'm just kind of in this space where I'm like, okay, and we're hearing about more of all of this. And as an African American, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's part of our story. But we had some joy in here. We made some music. We did some... we had dance. We had scientists who were solving world problems that they had nothing to do Sure, they had obstacles that they faced, but I guess I'm just kind of getting burned out on this narrative of that's taken so many of us back to a place of living in pain and having to relive it because this other part of society is just now hearing about it for the first time.
Well, it's you bring up a very powerful point at the end of the episode. Maybe that's a whole other show around. We get you watch it too, Lisa? Maybe where it's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. It's like there was like a bajillion slavery movies, right? And then we jump forward to like the civil rights movement, and it's almost like we've come back to capture a piece of history that hadn't been talked about. And so maybe, just maybe, all of this can lead to real policy change. I mean, if it just stays in the movie theaters, if it just stays on Netflix and HBO and Amazon, then it's just perpetuating trauma and nothing is being done. Take those millions that are being put into those films and put them into some real community change. Put them into some policy change. Get out the voter drive. Let's elect people that can pass policies and legislation that is not undoing our history. So hopefully it'll be a catalyst for something that's changed and not just opening the wound just to leave it to fester again.
And it could also be for white folks that don't know about it, right? I mean, I think, yes.
But are they the ones watching it?
That's a good question.
But we need to get that message out.
That is a great question.
I mean, and again, this is
an education tool.
Well, and this is why I think there's a movement in our country around critical race theory,
right?
To keep these types of things suppressed,
right?
I don't know, man. I think
that's just one man's view.
You know what though? I think movies.
You okay? You need
I think movies. I think movies get made because they make money, and I think we're in a window of time right now where we're seeing a lot of media made because I think the market is right for it. And I think Hollywood's cranking out a lot of those stories. Was it back in the 90s? I want to say the story of Rosewood.
Oh, yeah. Cowboys, right? It was...
it was
different
wood.
No, it was the community in Florida, right?
But it was set in the 1800s, no?
Yes. Or something, right? Rosewood in Florida,
in
right.
Florida.
The Rosewood
I don't think they had
was,
cowboys.
I'm thinking, I'm about to Google it though.
Google that. Right. Now we're glad we got that piece of art for you to reference.
You know what? Y'all keep talking.
Okay.
Keep
y'all ain't gonna act right.
Keep on.
And so it's just John Singleton made that movie Rosewood to tell that story. Was that I want to say it was back in the late 1990s. And it is important to have these stories told, to have them in the narrative. But again, there are other stories, and I know we're starting to see a lot of those other stories.
Yeah.
But
well, and to an earlier point that you made, Terrence, around the access that we have in utility, the access that everyone has on their phone to information, and now you have LeBron James. It's like I don't have any of the big movie companies that are telling me what I can do and what I can't do. I got some money. We're going to make this film, and they make it and they put it out.
Right.
And so it's like, fine, you don't want to teach the history? We'll show you history because they come into a LeBron James show.
Yeah.
And you're going to know your history.
Yeah,
and everybody's going to know it. Yeah. And there's some power in that. So that is one way to reclaim community, to reclaim power. It's like, I don't need anyone's permission to put this out. And can do that. Any of us can do that on our phone using a video app and put it out on YouTube all day long. Before you know it, it's all out there. So, each one teach one, everyone. A piece of history, put it out there. Let's share it, and let's keep history real.
And as we, take this moment to commemorate the Tulsa Race Massacre, we also want to pause and acknowledge all of the other race massacres that happened during that same time frame over the course of 50, 60 years. Just important parts of American history that need to be told. And on that note, we got too much show and not enough time. We got to get out of here.
Always happens.
You've been listening to Funky Politics, powered by the Kazukian Network. Make sure you check out all of our content, both current episodes, upcoming episodes, past episodes. You can find them all at Kazukian.com or
Future
on
episodes.
Future episodes.
Other shows.
Other shows. All on the Kazukian app. Make sure you check them out. Follow us on Twitter at PoliticsFunky. And on behalf of my co-hosts, Terrence and Lisa, I am Lee Eric Smith, and this is Funky Politics. We out. We'll see you next time.
Funky Politics. Directed, produced, recorded, and distributed by Kazukian.